I never imagined a simple letter written with a crayon would change my life. It started with a question, one that had been circling in my mind for months. Does God really listen to children's prayers? I was 9 years old, sitting at our worn-out kitchen table, my teddy bear Mr. Fuzzy resting beside me, his loose button eye dangling slightly. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of my mother flipping through a stack of unpaid bills. I watched her, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she bit her lip as if trying to hold back tears. "Mom," I whispered, gripping my crayon tighter, "do you think God hears me when I pray?" My mother looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected such a question. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her tired blue eyes. "Of course he does, sweetie." "Then why hasn't anything changed?" I asked, my voice small. "I pray every night for things to get better, for you not to have to work so much, for Daddy to come back. But nothing happens." She took a deep breath and set down the bill in her hand. "Sometimes, God's answers come in ways we don't expect, Sarah." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. My fingers traced the frayed ear of Mr. Fuzzy as an idea formed in my mind. I would ask the president. He talked about God a lot on the news, and he said he wanted to help families. Maybe he knew the answer. Maybe he could help us. What if I wrote a letter and I asked, my excitement growing? What if I asked the president about God? My mother hesitated. I knew she wanted to protect me from disappointment, but she sighed and said, "Well, sweetheart, if you want to write a letter, we can send it." So that night, under the glow of our dim kitchen light, I carefully wrote, "Dear President Trump, does God really listen to children's prayers?" I told him about my mom, how hard she worked, and how sometimes it felt like no one saw us. And then, at the bottom of the page, I drew a picture of us. Just me, my mom, and a bright yellow sun above us. I had no idea that this letter, written in crayon, would not only reach the White House, but would change everything. 32 days later, I was sitting in my fourth grade classroom, trying to focus on math, when Mrs. Chen, the school secretary, walked in. She whispered something to my teacher, Miss Thompson, whose eyes widened. "Sarah Miller," she called, "please gather your things and go with Mrs. Chen." The whole room fell silent. My heart pounded as I pushed my chair back, my fingers trembling as I grabbed my backpack. Had something happened to my mom? Was Mrs. Rodriguez okay? I barely noticed Tommy Wilson snickering in the corner. "Maybe the president sent the FBI instead of a letter," he muttered. Mrs. Thompson shot him a sharp look. "That's enough, Tommy." I followed Mrs. Chen down the quiet hallways, my breath coming too fast. She led me straight to the principal's office. When we stepped inside, I saw Principal Roberts standing next to a woman in a black suit. She was holding a folder with an official-looking seal on it. On his desk, a phone sat on speaker mode. "Sarah," the woman said warmly, "my name is M. Parker, and I'm calling from the White House. We have someone here who would like to speak with you." My legs felt weak. "The White House," I whispered. A new voice came through the speaker, smooth and professional. "Hello, Sarah. This is Angela Morrison from the president's staff. We received your letter, and it touched a lot of hearts here." I couldn't breathe. They had read my letter. "The president was particularly moved by your questions about faith and your concern for your mother," Angela continued. "He would like to invite you and your mother to Washington, D.C. for a special meeting." I felt like I was floating. My hands were shaking so hard I barely noticed when Principal Roberts placed a cup of water in front of me. "A meeting?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Sarah. He would like to answer your questions personally." Mrs. Parker leaned forward. "We've already contacted your mother at work. She's on her way here now." I stared at them, at the phone, at the official-looking folder. The president had read my crayon letter. He had seen my drawing. And now he wanted to meet me. The office door burst open and my mother rushed in, still wearing her blue diner uniform, her face flushed with worry. She looked around wildly until she saw me, then let out a breath of relief. "Mrs. Miller," Angela's voice said over the speaker, "thank you for joining us. I was just explaining to Sarah that President Trump would like to invite you both to Washington, D.C. for a personal meeting." My mother sank into the chair beside me, gripping my hand tightly. I I don't understand. Is this real? Very real, Mrs. Parker assured her, pulling out several documents. We've arranged everything. Travel, accommodations, security clearance. All you need to do is say yes. I turned to my mom, my heart thudding in my chest. Mom, can we go? She looked at me, at the documents, then back at me. I saw the hesitation in her eyes. The diner, my other job. I can't just leave. We've spoken with your employers, Angela said. Everything has been arranged. You have 3 days off. Principal Roberts spoke up. Sarah will be excused from school. This is an incredible educational opportunity. My mother's grip tightened around my hand. I could see the emotions warring inside her. Fear, uncertainty, but also something else. Something like hope. Maybe Maria had been right. Maybe adults needed to believe more. Yes, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, we'll go. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and explanations. Miss Parker went over security protocols while Angela detailed our travel arrangements. We would fly to Washington, D.C. on Friday. Just 3 days away. As I stood to leave, a thought struck me. Can I tell Jenny? I asked. The adults exchanged glances before Miss Parker smiled. You can tell your classmates you're going to meet the president, but no other details for security reasons. I nodded, my heart still racing. I barely noticed when Principal Roberts gave me an encouraging pat on the back. I was too busy thinking about what Tommy Wilson would say when he heard. When I stepped back into my classroom, everyone looked up from their history lesson. Tommy's mouth fell open when he saw me smiling. Sarah, Miss Thompson asked, is everything all right? I stood straighter, my excitement bubbling over. I'm going to meet the president, I announced. He read my letter. The classroom erupted into excited chatter. Jenny squealed and ran to hug me. Even Tommy looked impressed, though he quickly tried to hide it. That afternoon when I got home, I ran straight to my waiting space, the corner of my room where I had been marking off days on a calendar. Mr. Fuzzy sat guard over it, his loose button eye staring up at me. It worked, I whispered to him, hugging him close. The president read our letter. We're going to Washington, D.C., and I had no idea that this was only the beginning. That night I could hardly sleep. I lay in bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to my ceiling, my fingers clutching Mr. Fuzzy tightly. My heart felt like it was beating too fast, like it was too big for my chest. Tomorrow we would leave for Washington, D.C. Tomorrow I would meet the president. Mr. Fuzzy, I whispered, turning to face my bear. What if I forget what I want to say? What if I get nervous and mess up? Mr. Fuzzy, as always, said nothing. His loose button eye, the one Mom had stitched back so many times, stared at me in the dim light. It's okay, I whispered again, as if comforting myself. I just have to be brave. Across the thin wall, I could hear Mom moving around in the kitchen. She had been quiet all evening, her face thoughtful as she packed our bags. Part of me wondered if she was scared too. The next morning we were up before the sun. Mom made me eat breakfast, even though my stomach was too jittery for food. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by to say goodbye, pressing a bag of cookies into my hands. For the airplane, mi amor, she said with a warm smile. Good luck. Our ride arrived right at 6 a.m. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and a serious-looking man in a suit stepped out. Miss Miller, Mrs. Miller, he greeted us. I'm Agent Brooks. I'll be escorting you to the airport. I stared up at him, suddenly realizing that this was real. I wasn't just a regular kid anymore. I was going to Washington, D.C., and a man in a suit was here to make sure we got there safely. The drive to the airport felt like a dream. Everything moved too fast and too slow at the same time. The airport itself was huge and confusing, but Agent Brooks guided us through it like it was nothing. I clung to my mother's hand, watching as our bags went through special machines and people in uniforms checked our papers. Mom, look, I gasped as we walked past a massive window. The planes are so big. She squeezed my hand, smiling. I could tell she was nervous too. On the plane, we had special seats near the front. The moment we took off, I pressed my face against the window, watching as the ground disappeared beneath us. It looks like a toy town, I whispered. Mom laughed softly. It does, doesn't it? For the first time in a long time, she looked almost relaxed. I leaned my head against her arm, the excitement finally turning into something warm and comfortable. The flight attendants brought us snacks, and I saved the wrapper as a souvenir. The whole time I kept Mr. Fuzzy close, his loose button eye pressing into my cheek. "Mr. Fuzzy," I whispered, "we're in heaven's neighborhood." When we landed, another car was waiting for us. A different agent, a woman named Agent Chen, greeted us with a smile. As we drove through the city, she pointed out famous buildings. "That's the Washington Monument," she said, gesturing out the window. "And over there is the Lincoln Memorial." I pressed my hands against the glass, taking it all in. "Maybe we can arrange for you to see some sights while you're here," Agent Chen added. The hotel was fancier than anything I had ever seen. The lobby had crystal chandeliers, and the carpets were so thick my feet sank into them. A man in a uniform carried our bags to our room, and when we got inside, Mom just stood there for a moment, looking overwhelmed. "Mom," I whispered, "we have a whole couch in here." "I know," she breathed, sitting on the edge of the bed. On the table, there was a fruit basket and a note welcoming us to Washington, D.C. "This is really happening," Mom murmured. That night, as she tucked me in, I clutched Mr. Fuzzy close. "Mom," I asked, my voice small, "do you think the president will really have the answers?" She brushed my hair back gently. "I think he'll try." "What if I forget what I want to say?" She smiled. "Then just speak from your heart, sweetheart." I nodded, feeling a little braver. "Mr. Fuzzy is coming too, right?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "He helped you write the letter, after all." As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about everything I wanted to ask the president, about God, about why some families struggle even when they work hard, about why prayers sometimes feel like they go unanswered. But I had no idea that the biggest surprise was still to come. The next morning we were up early again. I put on my best dress, a pink one with a white collar that Mom had found at a thrift store. She brushed my hair until it shone, and I made sure Mr. Fuzzy looked presentable too, though his loose button eye still dangled slightly. Breakfast was delivered to our room, pancakes shaped like stars and strips of bacon arranged in a smile. I could barely eat, but Mom insisted. "Big days need good breakfasts," she reminded me. At exactly 9 a.m., Agent Chen knocked on our door. "Ready for your special day?" she asked. I nodded, gripping my mother's hand tightly as we walked to the car. The drive to the White House seemed both too long and too short. When we finally arrived, my breath caught in my throat. The building was huge, its white walls gleaming in the morning sun. "It looks just like the pictures," I whispered. Security was intense. We had to go through several checkpoints where serious-looking agents checked our papers. At the final checkpoint, Miss Parker was waiting for us. "Good morning, Sarah, Mrs. Miller," she greeted warmly. She glanced down at my bear. "And this must be Mr. Fuzzy." I held him out, suddenly nervous. Miss Parker smiled as she inspected him. "He's cleared for entry," she said, winking. I giggled. We were led through grand hallways, past portraits and thick carpets. My feet felt like they were floating. Finally, we entered a small but elegant room with comfortable chairs. "The president will meet you here," Miss Parker explained. I sat very straight in my chair, smoothing my dress over and over. My mother squeezed my hand. "Just be yourself," she whispered. "That's what got us here in the first place." The door opened. Several serious-looking men in suits entered first. Then the president himself walked in. I forgot how to breathe. He looked exactly like he did on TV, but bigger, more real. Then, to my surprise, he smiled warmly. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice gentler than I expected. "And who's this fellow?" He nodded toward Mr. Fuzzy. I clutched my bear tightly. "This is Mr. Fuzzy, sir. He helped me write the letter." "Did he now?" The president crouched down slightly to look at the bear. "I see he's got a loose button eye there. Looks like he's been through quite a lot with you." I nodded, amazed that the president of the United States was talking about my teddy bear's eye. "Mom fixed it when it almost fell off," I explained, "but it still gets loose sometimes." "You know," the president said, settling into a chair across from us, "sometimes the things that are a little broken are the ones that help us the most. They remind us that we don't have to be perfect to be valuable." My heart thudded. Somehow, in just a few sentences, He had understood something important. Something even I hadn't put into words yet. I sat up straighter. I had so many questions. About God. About families like mine. About why things were so hard even when we tried our best. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to ask. Mr. President, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I wrote to you because I wanted to know if God really listens to children's prayers. Sometimes I pray and pray, but nothing changes. Does that mean he doesn't hear me? The president leaned forward, resting his hands on the armrests of his chair. His face was thoughtful, not like he was just giving me an answer, but like he really cared about what I was asking. Sarah, he said, I think God always hears us, but sometimes his answers don't come in the way we expect. Sometimes he answers through other people, or through moments we don't realize are part of something bigger. Like this letter you wrote to me. Maybe it was part of an answer you didn't see coming. I gripped Mr. Fuzzy tighter, his loose button eye pressing against my fingers. I had never thought about it that way. But what about families like mine, I asked. My mom works so hard, but it's still really tough sometimes. She does everything she can, but we still struggle. Why is it like that? The president nodded, his expression serious. That's a very important question, Sarah. And to be honest, it's something we've been thinking about a lot. Your letter made us stop and really look at how we can do more for families like yours. He reached into his jacket and pulled out my letter. The same letter I had written in crayon, my picture of me and Mom still there at the bottom. Your words helped to remind me that real people, real families, are working hard every single day, and we need to do more than just talk about helping them. We need to take action. I stared at my letter in his hands, my heart thudding. I never thought anyone important would read it, let alone that it would make a difference. Mrs. Miller, he said, turning to my mom, we've been developing a new program to support single parents who work multiple jobs but still struggle. We're calling it the Loose Button Initiative. I blinked. Loose button? I echoed. The president smiled. Yes, because of Mr. Fuzzy here. His loose button eye shows that even when something isn't perfect, it still has value. It still has a story to tell. Just like hardworking parents who keep everything together, even when things aren't easy. I looked down at Mr. Fuzzy. For so long, I had thought of his loose button as a flaw, something broken. But now it felt different. It felt like proof that he had been loved, that he had been through things with me and still stayed by my side. Your letter, the president continued, helped inspire us to make this program a reality, and we'd like your mother to be part of the pilot group. It would mean better hours, better pay, and most importantly, more time with you. Mom gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Mom, I burst out before I could stop myself. The president laughed, a warm sound that filled the room. Your daughter has good instincts, Mrs. Miller. Mom turned to look at me, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'd love to be part of it. I felt like I was floating, like I had stepped into a dream and didn't want to wake up. The president studied me for a moment, then reached into his pocket again. This time he pulled out a small box and handed it to me. Inside was a shiny new button. This is for Mr. Fuzzy, he said, but only if you want to change his eye. Sometimes the things that seem broken are actually what make us special. I looked at the button in my palm, then at Mr. Fuzzy's familiar, well-loved face. I thought about the day Mom had sewn his button back after Dad left, how many nights I had held him tight, how much that little imperfection meant to me. Thank you, Mr. President, I said, closing the box. But I think Mr. Fuzzy should keep his loose button. It tells our story. The president's smile widened. Sarah, I think you just taught all of us something very important. After our meeting, the president asked if he could share my story. He said that sometimes the smallest voices make the biggest difference, and he wanted other families to hear about mine. I nodded, feeling something warm spread through my chest. If my letter could help others, I wanted that more than anything. As we left the White House, reporters were waiting outside. Miss Parker said it was okay for me to answer a few questions, so I held up Mr. Fuzzy and told him about his loose button eye and how it wasn't really broken. It was just part of his story. By the time we got back to our hotel, my story was already on the news. People across the country were hearing about the little girl who wrote to the president about faith and family and teddy bears with loose buttons. But I had no idea how big it would get. The next morning at the airport, Agent Chen handed me a large envelope. "This is from the president," she said, smiling. "But he said you should wait until you're on the plane to open it." I held the envelope tightly all through security and takeoff, my fingers itching to see what was inside. When we were finally in the air, I turned to Mom. "Can I open it now?" She nodded, so I carefully peeled it open. Inside was a letter, written in handwriting instead of typed, and a stack of smaller envelopes. "Dear Sarah," Mom read aloud, "after you left yesterday, something incredible happened. We shared your story, and soon letters started pouring in from families across America. They all wanted to share their own loose button stories with you." I stared at the envelopes in my lap, my heart racing. I picked up one and opened it. "Dear Sarah," the letter inside read, "I saw you on the news and I wanted to tell you about my old baseball glove. It's got a tear in the leather, but my dad gave it to me before he passed away. I used to think it was broken, but now I think of it as special. Thank you for helping me see that." My hands shook as I opened another. "Dear Sarah, my mom and I don't have a lot of money, but we always try our best. Sometimes it's hard. But when I saw you talking about your mom, I realized we're not alone. Thank you." Letter after letter, people shared their stories with me about old shoes, worn-out blankets, broken family photos, things that weren't perfect, but were still filled with love. And then, at the bottom of the stack, I saw one more envelope. It was marked with a gold star. I opened it carefully, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words inside. "Sarah, you probably don't remember me, but I remember you. 3 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I left when I should have stayed. I've been watching you on the news and I finally got the courage to write. I want to be better, to try again, if you and your mother will let me. If you're willing, I'd like to start with a cup of coffee, somewhere public, just to talk." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My father had written to me. I looked up at Mom, my hands shaking. She was crying, but she wasn't sad. She was hopeful. "Mom," I whispered, "he wants to meet us." She reached out, smoothing my hair the way she always did. "What do you think, sweetheart?" I looked at the letter, then down at the small button still clutched in my other hand. "I think," I said slowly, "that everyone deserves a chance to fix their loose buttons." Mom pulled me into a hug, holding me so tight I could barely breathe. Outside, the plane soared through the clouds, carrying us home. But I knew that home wasn't just a place. It was love. It was family. And sometimes, even broken things could find a way to heal. Mr. Fuzzy sat in my lap, his loose button eye catching the morning light. And for the first time I realized it had never really been broken at all. When we landed back home, I was still clutching my father's letter in my hands. My fingers traced the edges of the paper, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't untangle. I had spent years wishing he would come back, praying that one day he would walk through the front door like he had never left. Now he was reaching out, but it didn't feel the way I had imagined. "What do you want to do, sweetheart?" my mom asked softly as we stepped off the plane. I looked up at her, searching her face for an answer. I could tell she was nervous, too. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt when Dad left. She had carried the weight of it every day, in every late-night shift, in every exhausted sigh over a pile of bills. But she wasn't saying no. She was letting me choose. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I think I want to meet him." Mom squeezed my hand. "Okay." When we walked through the airport doors, I was surprised to see a crowd waiting for us. At first, I thought it was just regular travelers, but then I saw familiar faces. Mrs. Rodriguez, Miss Thompson, my classmates. Even Tommy Wilson was there, shifting uncomfortably as he held a small sign that read, "Welcome home, Sarah." My best friend Jenny came running up first. "You were on the news," she practically yelled, grabbing my hands. "Everyone was talking about you. My mom cried." Before I could respond, Tommy stepped forward. His face was red, and he kept looking down at his feet like he was trying to figure out how to stand. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Hey," he muttered. I saw your story. It was cool." I blinked. Tommy Wilson had never said anything nice to me before. He hesitated, then held something out to me. Here, he mumbled. I, um, I brought this. I looked down at his hands. Resting in his palm was a small action figure. One of the arms was missing, and the paint was scratched in places. I always thought it was kind of dumb because it's broken, he admitted. But, I guess not everything broken is bad. I stared at him, then at the toy. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the little box the president had given me. The one with the spare button for Mr. Fuzzy. This is for you, I said, handing it to him. His eyes widened. Huh? Not to fix your toy, I said, but to remind you that broken things tell important stories too. His face turned even redder, and for a second I thought he might throw the button back at me. But instead he nodded, stuffing the box into his pocket. Thanks, he muttered, then quickly ran back to his mom. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she hugged me. Mi amor, I am so proud of you. Thank you, I whispered, hugging her back. On the drive home, Mom kept glancing at me, like she wanted to ask if I was okay, but I didn't know how to answer. Everything felt too big, too much to process all at once. You don't have to decide anything today, she said gently. About your dad, I mean. We can take our time. I nodded, staring out the window. Outside, the streets looked the same as they had before we left, but I felt different. When we got home, I went straight to my room. I had left everything exactly the way it was. The waiting space, the calendar full of X's marking each day I had waited for a response. But now those X's weren't just about waiting. They were proof of something real. Proof that hope wasn't wasted. I picked up Mr. Fuzzy and sat on the floor, running my fingers over his worn fabric. Well, Mr. Fuzzy, I murmured, we did it. We actually did it. He didn't say anything, of course, but for the first time I felt like he didn't need to. 2 days later, my mom and I met my dad at a small cafe near the park. I had been so nervous all morning that I thought my stomach might turn inside out. When we walked in, he was already sitting at a table near the window. He looked different than I remembered. Older, more tired, but when he saw me, his eyes lit up in a way that made my heart ache. Sarah, he breathed, standing up. I hesitated for only a second before walking over. He bent down slightly, unsure if he should hug me. I didn't know what to do either, so I just nodded at him. Hi, I said. He let out a shaky laugh. Hi. Mom sat down across from him, her face calm but cautious. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know where to start. Maybe the truth, Mom suggested. He nodded. Yeah, the truth. He turned to me. Sarah, when I left, it wasn't because I didn't love you. I was scared. I thought I was failing as a husband and as a dad, and instead of facing it, I ran. I've regretted it every single day. I stared at him, my chest tightening. Then why didn't you come back? Because I thought I didn't deserve to, he admitted. But then I saw you on the news. I saw you talking about faith, about how broken things can still be important. And it made me wonder if maybe I still had a chance to be part of your life. I looked down at my hands. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much it had hurt when he left. But another part of me, the part that had spent so many nights wishing for this moment, wanted to believe him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the button from his letter. The one from his old police uniform. I placed it on the table between us. You said this was your loose button, I said. Do you really want to fix it? He looked at the button, then at me. More than anything. I swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. Then we can try. His face crumpled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, I saw my dad. Not as the man who had left, but as the man who was trying to come back. When we left the cafe, my mom reached over and brushed a hand through my hair. You okay? She asked. I nodded. Yeah, I think so. At home, I went to my room and looked at my calendar one last time. Instead of drawing another X, I picked up a crayon and carefully drew a small button on today's date. Because this wasn't just another day of waiting. It was a day of new beginnings. Mr. Fuzzy sat on my bed, his loose button eye exactly where it had always been. And for the first time, I truly understood. It had never really been broken at all. The days that followed felt different. Lighter, somehow. Mom still worked hard, but now there was hope in her eyes where exhaustion used to be. She started talking about the training program the president had invited her to join. For the first time in years, she let herself dream about a future that wasn't just surviving, but living. I was still figuring things out with Dad. We didn't rush anything. He wrote me letters, real ones, not just texts or emails. I wrote back. Sometimes we met for ice cream, and he told me stories about when I was little, things I had forgotten or never knew. One afternoon, I sat in my room, looking through the stack of letters I had received after my story was shared on the news. Hundreds of people had written to me about their own loose-button stories. Letters from kids who felt invisible, parents who struggled like mine, people who had been told they weren't enough but were learning that they were. One letter stood out. It was from a girl named Annabelle. Dear Sarah, my name is Annabelle. I'm 11, and my little brother has autism. Sometimes people don't understand him, and they think he's weird because he does things differently. My mom says he's perfect just the way he is, but I used to wish he could be normal, so people wouldn't treat him differently. But when I saw your story, I thought about how his loose button isn't something that needs to be fixed. It's part of who he is, and that makes him special. Thank you for helping me see that. I read the letter twice, then once more. Annabelle had understood something important, something even grown-ups struggled to see. Mr. Fuzzy, I whispered, running my fingers over his worn fabric. We helped someone. Mrs. Rodriguez always said good things come to those who wait. I had spent weeks waiting for a letter from the president, thinking that would be the answer to everything. But now I realized that the real answer wasn't in a single letter or a single moment. It was in every person my story had reached, every life that had been touched in ways I couldn't even imagine at school. Things were different too. Miss Thompson had me stand in front of the class and talk about my trip to Washington, D.C. What was the president like? Jenny asked, eyes wide with curiosity. He was really nice, I said honestly. He listened. Did he give you anything? Tommy Wilson piped up from the back. I hesitated, then smiled. He gave me a new button for Mr. Fuzzy, but I decided to keep the old one. Why? Tommy frowned. Because it tells our story, I said simply. The class was quiet for a moment. Then Miss Thompson spoke. That's a beautiful lesson, Sarah. Sometimes the things we think are flaws are actually what make us special. I glanced at Tommy. To my surprise, he wasn't rolling his eyes. He just nodded. After school, he walked up to me while I was getting my things from my locker. Hey, he muttered. Hey, I replied. He shuffled his feet. So, I gave that button to my little cousin, the one you gave me. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah. He scratched the back of his head. He's got this old stuffed dog he never lets go of, and one of its eyes fell off a long time ago. He always said he didn't want to fix it, because he was afraid it wouldn't be the same. But when I told him about your story, he wanted to put the button on himself. I smiled. That's really cool, Tommy. He nodded, then shoved his hands in his pockets. So, thanks. I watched him walk away, realizing that the boy who had once laughed at me had learned something too. Maybe people weren't perfect either. Maybe we were all just a little like Mr. Fuzzy, held together by the people who loved us, even when we felt like we were falling apart. That night, Mom and I sat at the kitchen table. There were still bills, but she wasn't looking at them the same way. Instead, she was reading over some papers from the job training program. Mom? I asked. She looked up. Yes, sweetheart. Are we happy now? She blinked as if the question surprised her. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. We're getting there. I nodded. Me too. Before bed, I sat in my waiting space, where the calendar full of X's still hung on the wall. I traced one of the marks with my finger, remembering how long I had waited for an answer. Then instead of marking another X, I took a crayon and drew something new. A sun, shining bright above all the days that had passed. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving forward. Mr. Fuzzy sat beside me, his loose button eyes staring back at me like always. And for the first time, I truly understood. He was never broken. He was just like me, whole, even with the things I used to think were missing. As the days passed, life settled into something new, something that felt lighter, Mom's training program was starting soon, and for the first time, she talked about the future without sounding exhausted. I had never seen her so hopeful before. I was still figuring out what things meant with Dad. He wasn't suddenly back in our lives like nothing had happened, but he kept writing letters. I kept writing back. Some days, we met for coffee or ice cream, and it didn't feel as scary anymore. One afternoon, he picked me up from school. It was the first time he had ever done that. "How was your day, kiddo?" he asked as I climbed into his car. "Good," I said. "We learned about poetry." "You like poetry?" I shrugged. "Some of it. I like the ones that don't rhyme." He chuckled. "Yeah, me too." We drove in silence for a bit. I watched the buildings blur past the window, feeling the weight of everything we still hadn't talked about. Finally, I asked, "Do you think people can really change?" He let out a breath, keeping his eyes on the road. "I think they can try." "Are you trying?" He glanced at me, his face serious. "Every single day." I didn't say anything else. But when we pulled up to my apartment, I didn't rush to get out of the car like I used to. "See you later, Dad," I said instead. He smiled. "See you later, kiddo." Inside, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some papers. When she saw me, she smiled. "How was it?" I hesitated. "Not bad." She nodded like she understood. Because she did. Things weren't perfect, but they were getting better. That night, I sat on my bed with Mr. Fuzzy in my lap, looking at the stack of letters I had gotten from people across the country. Letters from kids who felt invisible, parents who struggled like mine, people who had been told they weren't enough but were learning that they were. I picked up a new one, unopened until now. "Dear Sarah, I saw your story on the news and I just wanted to say thank you. When I was a kid, I had a stuffed rabbit with a missing ear. I used to be embarrassed by it, but now I wish I had kept it. I think about what you said, how broken things tell important stories. I think I needed to hear that." I set the letter down, my chest warm with something I couldn't quite name. I had thought my story was just mine. Just me, my mom, and Mr. Fuzzy, but it had reached people I had never met. It had made them feel seen, and maybe that was the answer I had been searching for all along. I hugged Mr. Fuzzy close, his loose button eye pressing against my cheek. "We did good, buddy," I whispered. "We did real good." Outside my window, the stars flickered against the dark sky. My waiting space calendar was still there, but it wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about everything that had come after, because life wasn't just about the answers. It was about the moments in between, the loose buttons, the waiting, the hoping, and the beautiful things that happened when you finally stopped waiting and started believing. The days turned into weeks, and life kept moving forward. Mom started her job training program, and for the first time, she didn't have to work late every single night. She still worked hard, but there was something different in her now, something lighter, something free. At school, people still talked about my story sometimes. It was weird being the kid who had met the president. But the best part wasn't that. The best part was the letters. They still came. Every day, more letters from people who had seen my story, people who wanted to share their own. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, opening a new one. "Dear Sarah, my name is Maya, and I'm 14. When I was younger, my dad left too. I always thought it was my fault, like maybe if I had been better, he would have stayed. But when I saw you talk about your teddy bear's loose button eye, it made me think about how maybe we don't have to be perfect for people to love us. Maybe we don't have to be fixed to be enough." I swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in my eyes. I had spent so long thinking I was the only one who had ever felt that way, but I wasn't alone. Mom sat across from me sipping tea. "Another one?" I nodded, handing her the letter. She read it, her face softening. "You really did something special, sweetheart," she said. "I didn't mean to," I admitted. "I just wanted an answer." She smiled. "And you got one, just not in the way you expected." I thought about that for a moment. Maybe she was right. That weekend, Dad and I went to the park. It was still strange, spending time with him again. But little by little, it was becoming less scary. We sat on a bench, watching kids play on the swings. "When you were little," Dad said suddenly, You used to love the swings. You'd scream every time I pushed you too high, but you always wanted to go higher. I laughed. Sounds about right. He hesitated. I missed a lot. I didn't answer right away. Yeah, I finally said. You did. He let out a breath. I know I can't make up for everything, but I want to try. I looked at him, at the man who had once been a stranger, and nodded. Okay. We sat there for a while, just watching the world move around us. Later that night, back in my room, I picked up Mr. Fuzzy and held him tight. You know what, buddy? I whispered. I think we're going to be okay. His loose button eye stared back at me, and for the first time I realized. I believed it. Things weren't perfect, but maybe they didn't have to be. Maybe life wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about holding on, even when things felt broken. Maybe it was about the loose buttons, the ones that made us who we were, the ones that told the best stories. A few months passed, and life kept changing in ways I never expected. Mom finished her training program, and soon after, she got a new job, one that paid better with normal hours. For the first time in forever, she was home for dinner every night. She wasn't always exhausted. She even started laughing more. And Dad, well, he was still here, still trying. We were still figuring things out. But that was okay. Some things took time. The letters never stopped coming. Every day after school, I'd check the mailbox, and there would be more. Some from kids like me, some from adults who had carried their own loose buttons for years without realizing they didn't need fixing one day. There was a letter with a return address I didn't recognize. I sat on my bed and carefully opened it. Dear Sarah, you don't know me, but I saw your story. I work at a community center for kids who don't have much, and I wanted to tell you something. After we heard about you, we started a project. We collected old stuffed animals, ones that were a little worn out, ones with missing pieces. We gave them to kids who needed them, and we told them your story. We told them that sometimes the things that aren't perfect are the ones with the most love in them. And you know what? They believed it. They held on to those toys like they were treasures. Because they are. Because you helped them see that. Thank you, Sarah. I pressed my hand against my chest, my heart pounding. Mom, I called, my voice shaking. She rushed into my room. What is it, sweetheart? I handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her eyes shining. They started a whole project, I whispered, because of my story. She reached out and brushed a tear from my cheek. No, honey, she said softly, because of you. I held Mr. Fuzzy in my lap, running my fingers over his worn fabric. Mom, I said hesitantly, do you think I should write back? She smiled. I think they'd love that. So I did. I sat at my desk, took out a piece of paper, and wrote, Dear everyone at the community center, thank you for telling me about your project. It means a lot to know that something small, something like a teddy bear with a loose button eye, could help other people feel seen. I used to think that things had to be perfect to be special. Now I know that's not true. Sometimes the best things are the ones that have been through something. Sometimes the best stories come from what we thought were flaws. I hope the kids who got those stuffed animals love them as much as I love Mr. Fuzzy. Tell them their loose buttons are important. They are not broken. They are special. Your friend, Sarah. I read it over once, then folded it up and slipped it into an envelope. Mr. Fuzzy, I whispered, smiling to myself, I think we started something really big. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. I already knew. We weren't just telling our story anymore. We were helping other people tell theirs. As more time passed, my life felt like it had shifted into something new, something I never could have imagined before I wrote that letter. The world wasn't perfect, but I didn't need it to be. Mom was finally happy. She wasn't working herself to exhaustion anymore, and she even had time to help me with my homework in the evenings. Sometimes she would hum to herself while she cooked dinner, something I hadn't heard in years. Dad was still here. Not every day, not in the way he used to be. But he was here. We went for walks in the park, grabbed ice cream on weekends, and he never missed one of my school events. And the letters, they still came. Some days I would get letters from kids who had been bullied, telling me that my story made them feel like they mattered. Other times I'd get notes from parents who had been struggling, thanking me for reminding them that they weren't alone. One day, a package arrived at our door. It was from the White House. Inside was a framed picture of my original crayon letter, the same one I had written late at night at our old coffee table. Mr. Fuzzy propped up beside me. There was also a small plaque attached to the bottom. Sarah Miller, a reminder that faith, hope, and love are never wasted. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the edges with my fingers. "Mom," I whispered, my throat tight. "It's real." She pulled me into a hug. "It's always been real, sweetheart." That night, I sat in my room, looking at my waiting space. The calendar was still there, full of X's. I had been waiting for an answer when I wrote that letter, but I had no idea that the answer would come in so many different ways. Mr. Fuzzy sat on my bed, his loose button eye exactly where it had always been. "You know what, buddy?" I whispered. "I think we're part of something bigger now." And I was right. A few months later, the Loose Button Initiative officially launched. It wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about families all over the country, people who needed a little extra help, people who just wanted to spend more time together without worrying so much. The president mentioned my story when he spoke about it on TV. This initiative was inspired by a young girl who reminded us that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the smallest places, he said. Her story showed us that faith, even in the hardest times, can create real change. As I watched, sitting on the couch with Mom beside me, I realized something important. I had written that letter because I wanted to know if God listened to kids' prayers. I wanted to know if he heard me. Now I knew the answer. He had heard me all along. Sometimes the answer didn't come the way we expected. Sometimes it came through a teddy bear with a loose button eye. Sometimes it came through letters from strangers who felt seen for the first time. Sometimes it came through a mother's tired hands finally getting the rest they deserved. But the answer was always there. I just had to be brave enough to ask the question. That night, as I lay in bed, I picked up Mr. Fuzzy and hugged him tight. "We did it," I whispered. "We really did it." His loose button eye pressed against my cheek and I smiled, because I finally understood. It was never broken. It was a reminder that hope was never wasted. Weeks turned into months, and life kept moving forward. I was growing, changing, learning how to live in this new version of my world. One where my mom wasn't constantly exhausted, where my dad was trying to be part of my life again, and where my story had somehow become bigger than just me. The Loose Button Initiative took off in ways I never imagined. Programs were set up in cities across the country to help families like mine. Parents who worked long hours but still struggled. Kids who needed a little more time with the people they loved. Some families wrote to me, telling me how much it had helped them. Some sent pictures of their own stuffed animals with missing buttons or frayed seams, saying they finally understood that they didn't need to be fixed. They were already special. One day, Mom came home with something different in her hands. Not another bill, not another letter, but a newspaper. "Look at this," she said, handing it to me. Right there on the front page was a picture of a little boy holding a teddy bear. His bear looked a lot like Mr. Fuzzy, old, well-loved, with one eye hanging loose. The headline read, "How a 9-Year-Old Girl's Letter Changed America." I stared at it, my heart pounding. "Mom," I whispered, "you started something big." "Sweetheart," she said, "bigger than either of us ever imagined." I swallowed hard, looking down at Mr. Fuzzy in my lap. "But I was just asking a question," she smiled. "Sometimes asking the right question is the most powerful thing you can do." I thought about that for a long time. So one afternoon while I was at school, my teacher, Miss Thompson, called me up to her desk. "I have something for you," she said, handing me an envelope. I opened it slowly, my fingers shaking. Inside was another letter from the White House. "Dear Sarah, I wanted to write to you personally to thank you again for your courage, your faith, and your willingness to share your story with the world. Your words didn't just inspire me, they inspired an entire nation. The Loose Button Initiative is helping families because of you. Sometimes the best leaders aren't the loudest voices in the room. Sometimes they are the ones who ask the simplest, most honest questions. And sometimes they are 9-year-old girls with teddy bears who remind us all what truly matters. Keep believing, Sarah. Keep asking the big questions. The world needs more hearts like yours. Your friend, the president? I read the letter twice, then 3 times. I couldn't breathe. Miss Thompson, I whispered. He wrote back again. Her eyes filled with tears. I knew he would. After school, I ran all the way home. When I burst through the door, Mom turned in surprise. Sarah, she asked, what is it? I handed her the letter, unable to speak. She read it slowly, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I am so proud of you, she whispered. I looked down at Mr. Fuzzy, his loose button eye staring back at me. I think we did something really good, Mom, I said softly. You did, sweetheart, she said, and it's only the beginning. Mr. Fuzzy sat in my lap as I stared out the window, the world outside painted in the golden colors of sunset. Everything felt different now, lighter, warmer, like the weight I had carried for so long had finally lifted. Mom was happier. She worked one job now, one that let her be home in the evenings, one that didn't drain the life out of her. We had dinner together every night. We laughed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Dad and I were still figuring things out, but he was here. He was trying. Sometimes that was enough, but not everyone was happy about what happened. One day at school, I walked into class and the room went quiet. Tommy Wilson sat slumped in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I slid into my chair next to Jenny. What's going on? I whispered. She gave me a nervous glance. Tommy's mad, she said quietly. His dad lost his job at the factory. He said it's because of the new programs the president started. I froze. I didn't know what to say. After class, Tommy cornered me near the lockers. His face was red, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're so special, don't you? He spat. Writing your little letter, making a big deal out of nothing. You ruin things for people like my dad. His words hit me like a slap. I didn't mean... Yeah, well, it doesn't matter what you meant, he snapped. Some of us don't get lucky just because we write a stupid letter to the president. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the straps of my backpack. Tommy, I never wanted to hurt anyone, I said softly. I just wanted things to be better, he scoffed. Yeah? Well, not everything gets better. He turned and stormed off, shoving past a group of kids in the hallway. I stood there, my heart pounding. For the first time, I wondered if maybe my story had hurt someone. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the letter the president had sent me, the one framed next to my waiting space calendar. Had I done the wrong thing? I picked up Mr. Fuzzy and hugged him close. I just wanted to help, I whispered. Mom knocked gently on my door. Sweetheart? I didn't turn around. Mom, did I ruin things for people? She sighed, stepping into my room. Oh, Sarah, she murmured, sitting beside me. No, you didn't ruin anything. But change isn't always easy. Some people will struggle with it. Some people will be angry. But that doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do. I bit my lip. Tommy said his dad lost his job. She nodded. I heard. But Sarah, things were already changing in that factory. Sometimes people look for someone to blame, even when it's not really their fault. I thought about that for a long time. The next day, I found Tommy sitting alone on the swings at recess. I hesitated, then walked over, sitting on the swing next to him. He didn't look at me. I'm sorry about your dad, I said softly. I really am. He kicked at the dirt. Whatever, he muttered. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, I reached into my pocket and pulled out something small, the extra button the president had given me. Here, I said, holding it out. He glanced at it. What's that? A reminder, I said, that things don't have to be perfect to be okay. He stared at it for a long moment. Then without a word, he took it. I didn't know if it would change anything. Maybe it wouldn't. But maybe, just maybe, it would mean something to him one day. Sometimes, the people who hurt the most just needed someone to see them. As the days passed, I realized something important. Life was full of loose buttons. People, families, entire communities. Some would be fixed, some wouldn't. But all of them had a story worth telling. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't just hoping, I was moving forward. Mr. Fuzzy's loose button eye would always be there, A reminder that broken things could still be loved, that imperfection was not failure. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. For everyone who has ever felt like they weren't enough, like they were too broken, too lost, remember this: you don't have to be perfect to be special. Your loose buttons, your scars, your struggles, they are part of your story, and your story is worth telling. If you've ever had a moment in your life where something imperfect turned out to be something beautiful, share it in the comments below. Because sometimes, the most powerful answers come in ways we never expect. Sometimes they come with loose buttons.